At 11 minutes past midnight, a young widow entered Caleb Hart's rented room with a revolver beneath her coat. "My room only has one bed," the cowboy warned. "That's perfect," she said, pulling the pins from her hair. "They must believe I spent the night here." Then Sheriff Amos Pike started climbing the stairs. Snow tapped the window of the Silver Bell Hotel. Wind pressed cold fingers through every crack. Caleb stood beside the wash basin, one boot off, his gray shirt open at the throat. He watched the stranger hide her black bonnet beneath his bed. Stay close to her, because the paper sewn inside her sleeve had already placed one man in the ground. Her name was Clara Whitmore. Caleb knew that much. Everyone in Red Hollow knew the widow who had arrived on the noon train carrying her husband's pine box. Daniel Whitmore had worked as bookkeeper for the Barcy Ranch. His horse had come home 3 nights earlier with blood across the saddle. Pike called it a robbery. Clara had stared at the sheriff until he stopped speaking. Now red drops marked her cuff. "Is that yours?" Caleb asked. Clara looked down. "No." Heavy steps reached the landing. She crossed the room and sat on the mattress. Her hands shook once. She pressed them flat against the quilt. Then she loosened her hair across her shoulders and turned her face toward the lamp. "Open up, Hart," Pike called. Caleb had met the sheriff only twice. Both times, Pike's eyes had rested on Caleb's gun before reaching his face. "What do you want?" "A woman killed Silas Crow at the telegraph office." Clara's breath stopped behind him. Caleb opened the door 6 inches. Pike filled the gap in a buffalo coat dusted white. 2 deputies waited behind him, rifles upright. Melted snow ran from their hats onto the floorboards. "You alone?" Pike asked. Caleb glanced over his shoulder. Clara drew the quilt across her knees. A strand of copper hair covered one green eye. She looked down as if Pike had caught her where no proper woman wished to be seen. One deputy gave a crooked grin. Pike did not. "She got a name?" "She does," Caleb said. "I asked what it was." Clara lifted her chin. "Mrs. Hart." The lie hung between them. Caleb heard a floorboard creak under the sheriff's heel. Pike looked at the single bed, Clara's bare hair, and Caleb's missing boot. His gaze moved slowly toward the dark bonnet barely visible beneath the iron frame. Clara slid her foot forward and covered it with her skirt. From the street came the sharp cry of a horse. Pike turned toward the window. Crow was shot with a small pistol, same kind a widow might carry. "Then question every widow in Wyoming," Caleb said. Pike pushed the door wider. Caleb planted one shoulder against it. For 3 breaths, neither man moved. Then the hotel clerk called from below. "Sheriff, they found tracks behind the telegraph office." Pike stepped back. "Enjoy your wedding night, Hart." His boots crossed the landing. The deputies followed. Caleb waited until the front door slammed before shutting the room and turning the key. Clara pulled the revolver from her coat and placed it on the quilt. The cylinder was empty. "Crow shot at me first," she said. "Daniel left proof with the telegraph operator. Crow came to take it. And now Crow is dead." The operator fired from under his desk. Crow fell against me. Pike's men took the operator through the back door. Caleb picked up his other boot but did not put it on. "Why choose me?" Clara reached inside her sleeve. Stitches snapped under her thumbnail. She drew out a folded payroll sheet stained at one corner. Names ran down the page beside sums of money. Sheriff Pike, Judge Warren, Silas Crow. Near the bottom, Caleb found a name that tightened every muscle along his back. Ethan Hart. The room seemed smaller now, crowded by 6 lost years, and the brother Caleb had searched for across every frozen trail. His younger brother had vanished 6 years before. Caleb had followed cattle trails from Kansas to Wyoming searching for him. Every trail had ended in dirt. Where did Daniel get this? Clara folded the page before he could study the numbers. From the locked office at Bar C, a soft scrape came from outside. Caleb raised one finger. Clara froze. The scrape moved below the window. Not boots, metal against wood. Caleb crossed the room and lifted the curtain with his gun barrel. Orange light climbed the hotel wall. Someone had poured oil across the porch roof. Flames rolled toward their window while men gathered in the snowy street. Sheriff Pike looked up, struck a match, and smiled. The window burst inward before Caleb could reach the latch. Glass struck the floor. Heat rolled across the room. Clara covered her face while Caleb dragged the quilt from the bed and beat down the burning curtain. "The hall," she said. Smoke pushed beneath the door. Caleb kicked the mattress from its iron frame. Together, they shoved it against the flames, climbing through the window. The wool caught slowly, giving them seconds. He tied 2 sheets around the bed frame and threw the loose end into the alley. "You first." Clara wrapped the cloth around her wrist. "That knot will slip." She pulled it apart, made another, and climbed onto the sill. Snow spun around her black dress. 20 feet below, a wagon stood beside the kitchen wall. Caleb lowered her until the sheets ended. "Drop." She landed on the wagon canvas. Caleb followed as the window above them blew outward in a tongue of fire. Men shouted from Main Street. Pike had placed his deputies at the front, waiting for 2 bodies to appear among the flames. Clara rolled from the wagon into deep snow. Caleb landed beside her and led her through a narrow passage behind the bakery. They reached the livery as the hotel bell began striking. Caleb saddled his chestnut gelding, Copper. Clara chose a gray mare and tightened the cinch without asking for help. "Where?" he asked. "The old Bar C slaughterhouse. That place closed years ago. Pike took Noah Grant there. He is the telegraph operator who shot Crow." Caleb looked toward the burning hotel. Black figures moved against the orange windows. "If Grant dies, your story dies with him." Clara mounted. "Then ride." They left through the stock gate as Pike's men entered the livery from the street. Snow erased the hoofprints almost as soon as they formed. The horses climbed north through cedar breaks, where the wind cut hard enough to water Caleb's eyes. At the ridge, Clara pulled the payroll sheet from her sleeve. "Daniel wrote one message before he vanished," she said. "Find Caleb Hart. Ethan knows the graves." Caleb's gloved hand closed around his reins. "You knew my name before entering that room. The hotel register told me which door. You pointed an empty gun at me. A loaded gun might have made me use it." Caleb studied the straight line of her shoulders. Frost clung to her loose hair. She did not ask whether he would turn back. Remember Caleb's hand on that payroll page. 6 winters had passed since Ethan vanished, yet Caleb still carried his brother's old knife inside his boot. The slaughterhouse appeared below them, a low stone building beside a frozen creek. No lamp burned, but fresh horse tracks cut through the yard. They left their mounts among the cedars. Caleb drew his revolver. Clara took the empty pistol anyway. "Stay behind me." She raised one eyebrow. "Stay behind me," he corrected. They crossed the yard. Frozen blood from forgotten cattle stained the loading boards. A chain knocked softly against the wall. The side door stood open. Inside, cold air carried the smell of old iron and wet rope. Caleb saw one lantern on the floor. Its weak flame showed a man tied to a chair. Noah Grant's spectacles were broken. One lens hung by wire. His shirt was dark beneath the ribs. Clara hurried to him and pressed 2 fingers below his jaw. Grant's eyes opened. "Mrs. Whitmore," he whispered. "The coffin. Save your breath. Daniel is not inside it." Her fingers stopped. A board creaked in the loft. Caleb turned and fired. His bullet struck a hanging hook as a rifle cracked above them. The lantern jumped, throwing wild shadows across the stone walls. A man descended the wooden steps with his rifle aimed at Caleb's chest. He was thinner than Caleb remembered. A pale scar crossed his mouth. His brown hair had gone gray at the temples, but the left ear still carried the notch made by a Kansas bull. Caleb lowered his gun 1 inch. "Ethan." His brother's rifle did not move. Clara stood beside Grant, the empty pistol held in both hands. Ethan looked at her black dress. "They told you he was dead." Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. "Who was in the box?" Caleb asked. "A ranch hand with Daniel's watch and a ruined face." Grant pulled against the rope. "Run." The main doors opened behind them. Sheriff Pike entered with 4 armed men. Another figure stepped through their line, brushing snow from a fine blue coat. Clara's knees struck the chair. The room tilted around her, and her hand reached for the wedding ring hanging beneath her collar. Daniel Whitmore raised a shotgun toward his wife. "Clara," he said, "you should have stayed beside my coffin." Daniel kept the shotgun leveled at Clara. "Give me the payroll sheet." She pulled the folded paper from her sleeve. Blood from her cut thumb marked his name. "You put another man in your coffin," she said. Daniel's mouth barely moved. A burned face asks no questions. "Your wife did." Pike stepped closer. Snow melted across his shoulders and dripped from his coat. Enough talking. Noah Grant stirred against the ropes. The wire went through Pike. Every gun shifted toward him. Grant coughed into his shirt. "I sent the names to Cheyenne before Crow entered my office. Federal marshals boarded the night train." Daniel looked at Pike. That single glance broke their partnership. Pike's jaw tightened. "He is lying." "Then why burn the hotel?" Clara asked. "Why bring 4 rifles for one widow?" Behind her, Caleb lowered his hand toward his boot. He drew Ethan's old knife and placed it on the stone floor. The blade slid between the brothers. Ethan looked down at the worn bone handle. His rifle dipped. "You kept it," he said. "You left it." Pike said you stopped searching. Caleb's eyes stayed on him. "Pike lies for wages." One deputy moved toward the knife. Ethan fired. The deputy spun into a meat rail. Caleb struck Pike before the sheriff could aim. Their bodies crashed against the loading table. Clara dropped behind Grant's chair as Daniel's shotgun tore splinters from the wall. She grabbed Ethan's knife and cut Grant's ropes. Rifles cracked inside the stone room. Iron hooks swung overhead. The lantern shattered, leaving only pale snowlight through the open doors. Ethan shot a second deputy in the leg. The other 2 fled through the side entrance. Pike drove his elbow into Caleb's throat. Caleb fell against the table, breath locked behind his teeth. Pike drew a short pistol from his coat. Daniel seized Clara by the back of her dress. She drove her heel into his knee. His shotgun struck the floor. Clara twisted away, but he caught her wrist and pulled her against him. "I gave you a fine house," Daniel hissed. She tore the wedding ring from beneath her collar and pushed it into his mouth. Daniel staggered, choking. Pike fired at Ethan. The bullet passed through Ethan's shoulder and struck Daniel beneath the ribs. Daniel looked down at the dark stain spreading across his blue coat. His fingers opened. He fell beside the payroll sheet. Clara knelt and took the brass key from his pocket. Daniel caught her sleeve. Blood shone between his teeth. "The graves are under the north pasture," he whispered. "How many?" His eyes moved toward Ethan. 17. His hand slipped from the cloth. The wedding ring rolled from his mouth and stopped beside the dead lantern. Clara closed Daniel's coat over the wound, with the payroll sheet beside him. Then Pike drove his knee into Caleb's chest. Caleb swept Pike's legs from under him. The pistol skidded through the rear doorway onto the frozen creek. Pike crawled after it. Clara snatched a cartridge from Daniel's belt, loaded her empty revolver, and followed. Wind drove snow across the ice. Pike reached the pistol and turned toward Caleb. Clara fired first. Her bullet struck the ice beside Pike's hand. A white crack raced beneath him. The creek broke open. Pike plunged to his chest in black water. His fingers clawed at the breaking edge, while the current pulled his legs beneath the ice. Caleb threw himself flat and reached out. "Take my hand." Pike stared at him, then grabbed. Caleb dragged the sheriff onto solid ice. Clara stood over Pike with the revolver steady, as Grant tied his wrists with the same rope that had held him. Inside, Ethan leaned against the wall. Caleb pressed cloth to his shoulder. "Took you long enough," Ethan said. Caleb gripped the back of his neck and touched his forehead to his brother's. At sunrise, the night train whistled beyond the ridge. Federal marshals rode into the slaughterhouse yard while Grant guarded Pike. They found Daniel beside his forged payroll, 3 deputies in irons, and the hidden graves Ethan marked on their map. 6 months later, snow returned to Red Hollow. Ethan stood outside a small church with his arm healed. Grant held the reins of a waiting wagon. Clara stepped through the church door wearing a plain cream dress, her copper hair bright beneath the winter sun. Caleb led her to a new cabin beyond town. At the doorway, he removed his hat. "My room only has 1 bed." Clara hung her black bonnet beside his hat and took his hand. That's perfect. Caleb lifted her across the threshold as Copper stamped snow from his hooves. If you stayed beside them to the final shot, subscribe and ride with the next Frontier story.